Much of Emily Dickinson's poetry is seemingly simple until we look again. Much of Emily Dickinson's poetry can be understood on some level, and then once you go digging just a little deeper, it becomes more and more intricate. This is maybe one of the hallmarks of great poetry itself. Today's poem from Emily Dickinson is sort of in that vein. Have you got a brook in your little heart? That is the name of the poem in question, and it reads as such. Have you got a brook in your little heart where bashful flowers blow and blushing birds go down to drink and shadows tremble so? And nobody knows, so still it flows, that any brook is there, and yet your little draught of life is daily drunken there. Then look out for the little brook in March when the rivers overflow, and the snows come hurrying from the hills, and the bridges often go. And later, in August it may be, when the meadows parching lie, beware lest this little brook of life some burning noon go dry. Now, I would be remiss not to sort of make some connection to my one of my favorite poems from Charles Bukowski, The Bluebird. Um, there's a bluebird in my heart, and no one knows he's there. This seems to start very much in that same fashion. Have you got a brook in your little heart where bashful flowers blow and blushing birds go down to drink and shadows tremble so? That seems to be where this is starting. This seems to be sort of that classic question. Do you even have a heart? Do you know what it is to love? One of these ideas. But our speaker does not let this poem die there. And nobody knows, so still it flows. This very reminiscent of Bluebird, suggesting that no one knows that the subject of our poem does have a heart inside, does in fact have the capacity to love, the capacity to care, that any brook is there, and yet your little draught of life is daily drunken there. This idea of the brook inside the heart, the running water inside the heart being that draught of life. That draught of life that does, in fact, get the subject of our poem, quote unquote, drunk. Now, this is where these two stanzas are where things get a little bit off the rails, in my opinion. Then look out for the little brook in March when the rivers overflow, and the snows come hurrying from the hills, and the bridges often go. Now, if we are to take sort of more of a classical approach to what this interpretation could mean, what we would be doing is saying, well, we're looking at the spring. The spring of life is, young adulthood. So we're talking here at the beginning of this poem to a child? Asking a child, do you have a heart? Well, then in your adolescent years, be careful. But here's the thing. We might be coming at if you were on my side with this, you might be coming at this, we might be coming at this with too modern a lens for this poem. It may be that the tone in this opening stanza is not quite what it is that we're making it out to be. It might not be doubtful. It might not be that the speaker is questioning whether the subject of our poem has a heart, in that he or she is questioning whether the subject of our poem is capable of love, because our speaker assumes they are too wretched. The common assumption, I think, when you read something like this is our speaker must be talking to a wretch, doubting that that wretch even has the capacity to love. It might not be that. It might be that our speaker here is talking to someone, not some Ebenezer Scrooge, but instead someone who seems to have had the capacity for emotions beaten out of them by life. Someone who is run down. Someone who is maybe living life sort of to get by as opposed to experience. If we readjust our reading of this poem with that assumption, all of a sudden everything is very, very different. Have you got a brook in your little heart? Is there anything still alive in you, still flowing through you, where bashful flowers blow, and blushing birds go down to drink, and shadows tremble so? Is there in you any of this life still to be had? And no one knows, so still it flows, because no one knows that you have that beating essence of life inside of you, because no one knows that there is still some joy for life inside you. Maybe they haven't taken it from you yet. That any brook is there, and yet your little draught of life is daily drunken there. Now it seems that perhaps we're not talking about some wretch with the capacity to love. We are talking about someone who seems to be beaten down by life, having a will to live, having something for which they wish to wake up in the morning. If that is the case, might this poem be Emily Dickinson speaking to Emily Dickinson? Emily Dickinson was the lady in white. Emily Dickinson did confine herself to the attic. Emily Dickinson stopped interacting at large with the world, but still there was this brook inside her little heart, the brook of poetry. And from that draught, she would daily drink. Then look out for the little brook in March when the rivers overflow and the snows come up hurrying from the hills and the bridges often go. Might we say that this also is what happened to Emily Dickinson? She was overflowed with the poetry, overflowed with that zest for life, and it took out the bridges. When she was flooded with poetry, it took out the bridges that connected her to other people. And later in August, when the meadows parching lie, beware lest this little brook of life some burning noon go dry. If we are to assume this in the classical sort of interpretation, or maybe the modern interpretation of this poem, where we are asking some wretch whether or not they have a heart, this final stanza does not make sense. This final stanza, if you're speaking to a wretch that does not appear to have the ability to love, we would not be warning them against the August would be the maybe you were an adult You were not in your 20s or 30s. You were maybe in your 40s or 50s, where you were looking at the coming winter. So it would not make sense to warn someone about their coming 40s or 50s looking at the very same situation that they find themselves in. However, if what we're talking about, instead of these classical symbols and whatnot, is someone talking about the will to live or a reason to live, is someone talking about their poetry, the thing for which they wake up in the morning, then this does make sense. What our speaker is warning against is saying, hey, at some point you might wake up and not have the muse. At some point you may wake up and no longer be able to write. You don't want that to happen, do you? You don't want to blow my sails in Europe, do you? If you know the Bukowski poem. So I think that there is an alternative, maybe, or perhaps primary interpretation of this poem to be had, that is, instead of asking some wretch about whether or not they have the capacity to love, asking someone who maybe only has one thing for which they live, hey, what's going on there? That's all I have for this poetry discussion. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do on the channel, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, the literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel. So consider hitting the subscribe button to stick around for more. I'm currently going short story by short story through Ernest Hemingway's entire short story collection, and I hope to have you back for the next video.